Hello.
Hi, Lisa.
Hello. How exciting. So I'm joined today on the podcast with Kiran Gill, founder of The Difference. And we've kind of been connected for quite a while and haven't really got around to speaking, but I put something out on Twitter saying, who would you really like to have on the podcast? And someone put Kathy Burke. So I wrote to Kathy Burke. Funnily enough, she didn't respond. I think she's busy at the moment with her All Woman. But somebody else wrote and said, I really want you to interview Kiran Gill. So I said, Kiran, are you interested? And she said, I am. So here we are. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. And I mean, that's a kind of illustrious potential guest. I'm pretty impressed to be, I'm not, I don't know, to be even anywhere near the same category as Kathy Burke, who is a legend.
She is totally a legend. And I have to confess, I've been catching up on her programme this afternoon and I just absolutely love her. She's just fantastic. Who knew that Kathy Burke would just be this, just so amazing. She's just aged into this fantastic icon for women. So, but you are pretty amazing too. I was having a little look at your website earlier. And you're pretty amazing too. And your passion, we share a passion, which is around exclusion.
Yeah.
But before we get into all of that, most people who are in education have had a fairly kind of relaxed month, checking out stuff, maybe doing up their score, maybe doing a bit of lesson planning, maybe even having a holiday, maybe doing some admin or sorting out systems. But you have not stopped all summer. What have you been doing?
Well, I would say sadly not, but actually happily not, because I have had one of the best summers I've ever had. I've got to be honest, Lisa. I have been on a kind of holiday to Jamie's Farm. I don't know if you know Jamie's Farm. It's brilliant, therapeutic space for children and young people. They take lots of school trips. But it wasn't a holiday, it was a working holiday. I was with 10 inspirational teachers who have quit their jobs in mainstream schools to specialise their careers in leadership of inclusive education. So these are guys that want to be head teachers, guys and girls, I use that as a unisex term, who want to be head teachers one day. And they know that if they're going to be the best head teacher they can be, they need to know how to teach the most vulnerable students. And they are going to cut their teeth in pupil referral units and AP academies over the next 2 years in leadership positions. So it was a really great working holiday. We were doing some fun farm things as well as learning. We mucked out the pigs and we did a welly throwing competition and got to know each other really. And they have inspired me hugely. And you can see I'm in a school now. We're in the second week of our training. So we do one on each side of the summer holidays. The first one's residential. That was at Jamie's Farm. This one is a bit more kind of getting ready for term. And every day has been really challenging, thought-provoking, and just inspiring to be with other teaching professionals that share my values and who are going off to do something amazing with their careers.
And what does it take when you say that they need to have the best skills, they're cutting their teeth and they're having the best skills to work with the most vulnerable? What are those skills? What are those skills that those teachers need to have?
Wow, that's a really good question. And I started our charity, The Difference, I guess, in order to kind of answer some of that question. And we call The Difference not the panacea. So I'm going to caveat what I'm going to say with, we don't know all the answers, right? There isn't a magic formula for people. But we do know some things about what works. And before I set up this charity, The Difference, I spent a year going up and down the country looking at fantastic mainstream schools that were really, really inclusive, and fantastic pupil referral units and AP academies, and all sorts of things in between. And we've pulled together a package of really exciting training for teachers based on some of the things that we think matter the most. Our programme for The Difference leaders has 4 strands: leadership, being a brilliant, authentic leader of people, and helping lead, I guess, staff teams, but also inspire and lead pupils, and lead within a local authority. So leadership, learning, being really passionate about why you came into the profession, being able to empower young people with learning. I guess I'm an English teacher, so I think a lot about literacy, but we've got a real cohort of varied practitioners, passionate about science, about maths, about equipping the young people they're working with the qualifications, but also the love of learning that they need for the rest of their lives. So leadership, learning, well-being, which is absolutely core, and about relationships. So learning about what's best practice out there for supporting people's mental health. And what do I, as a practitioner in my classroom, as a school leader in a school, and as a leader within my local authority, what can I do to really help young people have their mental health supported at school and have periods of trauma or difficulty to be supported through those, to stay in the community of a school. So well-being and safeguarding is massively key. So these are the 4 key elements of our training. And we've had a great week speaking to youth offending teams, understanding the perspective of police in multi-agency working with schools. And you can hear that I'm talking about some quite kind of complex issues, because the students that we're working with over the next 2 years with the difference leaders are those who've been excluded from school, and they are really likely to be multiply vulnerable, to have fallen behind at school potentially, to have maybe been failed by some of the professionals that they've worked with, and to really need the brilliant teachers and leaders that some of them already have, who can help pull things together for them in their life and hold them and help them finish school feeling great about themselves and with a good next step.
Yeah, and it's at the time of recording this, we're right at the end of August. My first training event that I'm running next week is at a pupil referral unit. So it's really exciting to talk to you. But one of the things that I really want to ask you, I suppose, is we've got very, very challenging narratives emerging this week. That are in direct conflict with what you're talking about, and those values are values that sit through all of my training as well. How likely is a school, a mainstream school, likely to be able to manage those kind of values against the political emerging narrative that really started? We're not surprised, but it was really kind of thrust into our faces yesterday around particularly the phrase reasonable force, which I've just found really disturbing to see that even in an educational context. That's
an apt question, and something we've been talking about here as a group of teachers and how we feel about it. I think it's really easy when you open the newspaper, especially at the moment, to feel depressed. Mm-hmm. But in that, you can get lost in remembering what impact you can have through a conversation with a student. Today, actually, we've got a student who is a head boy at a pupil referral unit. Was a head boy at a pupil referral unit. He now works at that pupil referral unit and is about to go off and join the army. And he's here talking about how the relationships with his head teacher and her relationship with his mum really changed things for his entire life. And I think we can, as teachers, open the newspaper and feel really disheartened and depressed. But it's really important that we let our natural optimism overcome some of that, because there is something you can do in September on your first day with young people that is totally counter to that kind of a narrative. And that's within your power, whoever you are, actually, whether you're a teacher, whether you're another professional, through the relationships that you have with people around you. And also, on a broader, more political note, because before I was a teacher initially myself, Lisa, and or a sister first, and then a teacher, and then I worked in policy. And now I run the charity The Difference. But when I was working in policy, we have seen some really positive moves towards thinking critically about exclusion and whether it's always right, whether there are things that we can do that reduce it by being proactive and thinking ahead of time. And that work's been sizable, and it's set in motion changes in the profession that are durable. It doesn't matter if the political narrative changes today or tomorrow. It's the case that Ofsted have started to look at off-rolling and been much more critical about how fixed-term exclusions are either escalating problems for young people, or actually whether there's a behaviour plan that's reintegrating students after a fixed term exclusion and improving the likelihood that they'll stay in that school community and not get permanently excluded. So that's Ofsted talking about exclusion, talking about brilliant inclusive practice and how they can recognise that more in the framework. That's happening regardless of a political narrative. We've got ASCL, the Association for School and College Leaders, and NAHT and the Chartered College of Leaders talking about what is ethical leadership. And that ethical leadership question is a big question, right the way from kind of exam gaming to your inclusive practice and how you make a decision to exclude, how you involve parents in the exclusion process, and what you've got preventative prior to permanent exclusion that can stop that from, or make that truly a last resort in your school. And ASCL, Chartered College, NAHT, Ambition School Leadership, those bodies are thinking about inclusive practice. That's a direction, regardless of the political narrative that's happening. So I think we've got to really guard against letting that pessimism set in before September begins. And we've got to look at the positive signs and I definitely feel right here in this school with these teachers, part of a movement. And remember that there are people out there who agree with us and our voices are loud when we sing together.
I felt quite galvanised. I mean, I did feel quite, sad because it seemed to be in such direct conflict with the Timpson review and with all the other things that you're talking about, Ofsted's changing framework. But I did actually come away just thinking, do you know what? Let's just roar into September. And because I know there are so many fantastic schools, fantastic teachers, and people who are so dedicated and committed to inclusion, every face of inclusion, that I just felt, all right, then bring it. It kind of brought that out in me. And I was really pleased to see that because, like you, I feel very much, it's easy to get overwhelmed. We're in very complex times, not just in education, but across the globe in every possible system is changing, is disrupting, is in chaos. So, like you, I just kind of think, well, what we can do in each interaction is actually what matters. Each interaction at a time. You might be interested at the, I've just seen today, the Rees Centre are holding a discussion in Oxford on the 7th of November. It's a free event all around exclusion, which I'm going to be at. So that might be something that, really, you should be there. Maybe I could step down and you...
Yes, please. I know you don't have to step down, Lisa.
But, send
me the details.
Yeah.
And we're running 2 conferences this November that are about doing just that, right? Let's get on with the good practice, with the people who aren't kind of maybe making the headlines, but actually are doing really incredible work with young people, with families, with the communities they serve, with their own communities. And let's talk about it. So we've got 2 conferences that we're calling Included, and they're in November. The 2nd of November is Included South, and the 9th of November is Included North.
We could have like an exclusion week then, couldn't we? The 2nd, the 7th, the 9th. But tell me this, we're in a very polarised time. We're in a very polarised situation thinking around education with the whole behaviour/relationships policies approach. What's compelling about your message where you might have a school in front of you or in front of one of the people that you're training who has no interest in thinking about relationships, the relationship side of that spectrum, and really wants to focus very much on punitive measures? How do you, because this is what people will be asking, they'll be sitting here listening and going, well, that's all very well and good, and thanks for your positivity, but I work in a school where the senior leadership team are not interested in this particular approach and are very much going down the other line. How are you compelling in terms of your discussion and argument, if you like, with people that have that lens through which they view children, schools and education?
I have a faith that most people, almost everyone in teaching, comes into teaching because they care about children and they want to make a difference in people's lives. And that's why they chose this job instead of a myriad other jobs. And it's mostly why they get up in the morning. But I also know what it feels like to work in an institution where you feel as though some of that's sapped and you find yourself just on autopilot doing stuff. And then you think, oh, why am I doing this? This isn't really what I came into teaching for. And I think where practices are happening that are not ideal for vulnerable children and that might be making the situation worse rather than better, not just vulnerable children, actually all children in the school, but are particularly affecting vulnerable children, I really, really refute the idea that those are bad people or evil people who are choosing to do that. I think instead, when we do things that are not ideal, we do them because we don't know what else to do. And we don't really know what works. And I think that's definitely the case in inclusive practice in schools, or in the other half of schools, in pastoral practice in schools, thinking about, what should your form time look like, or how do you do PSHE on sex ed, and what do you do if children are self-harming? There's so much where in education, we've not necessarily invested the resources in understanding what works, whereas we have in, say, how do you learn maths or how do you learn English? And I think what we need to do is just get a lot more evidence-based about those things. And some of that's going to require research in the future, but some of that research is already happening. So there is an evidence base in psychology. We know quite a bit about brains, about when people go into their kind of threat system and when cortisol's flooding through their body and what that does to them. And we're not taking some of that evidence and putting it into our practice in schools. But I think if we do, and if we can prove that that is actually having a beneficial effect for teachers who actually want to stay in a school rather than feeling stressed every day and thinking, God, I want to get out of the profession, or for students who might be from any background, we can make assumptions about who's vulnerable, but all children are vulnerable, all teenagers are vulnerable, actually systems, ways of working that improve their mental health because it's based on what we know in the evidence base in psychology. I think when we can prove that, there are lots of teachers and leaders who will be willing to change their mind. And it's always uncomfortable to change your mind, right? Sometimes the first time you have evidence that is different to what you've been doing for the past few weeks, years, it's uncomfortable and it makes you feel compromised and worried. But I think, the more we're able to positively, in a non-shaming way, show what works and show where things don't actually work, they make problems worse, they lead to higher exclusions, they lead to worse mental health for pupils, we're going to win this. War was a bad word, but win this disagreement about how education should be done. And we're going to improve by sharing best practice that is based on evidence rather than just on people's gut or what they've done before, or what they're doing because they're scared and they're just doing the quickest thing they know how to do.
And that is my experience, that, when people have the knowledge, when people know better, they do better.
Of course.
But that still doesn't detract from the fact that there is a narrative that's very clear, that evidence is not taken into account. And that's a challenge, because if that's what the school is being fed, and then people like me and you wander into the school and we start to do our training, I'm very explicit that what I'm talking about is not what they will be getting driven to them from government. It just isn't. It's the opposite. So that is a challenge. But the fact that people are calling people in anyway to look at that is the positive. But Tell me, when did you first get passionate about school exclusion?
In truth, it's something that I've always been aware of. My mum was a teacher, and she ran education action zones in the 90s and worked on improving pupil attendance, cutting exclusions, improving enrichment activities and engagement and access to those kinds of things in the place where I'm from, Hackney, and in kind of improving the access to education opportunities, but also extracurricular opportunities that other students in private schools, for instance, might take for granted. And so exclusions was kind of something I knew about in my household from quite young, but I swore I was never going to be a teacher. And as you do when your parents are teachers. And my sisters were not permanently excluded, but they were fixed term excluded when they were at school and I was training to be a teacher. And my sisters actually were adopted into my family and had experienced some early trauma. And whilst I was teaching, I had this real, cognitive dissonance, I guess, between what I was thinking about in my school and how I knew my sisters were feeling in their school. To be in the bottom sets all the time, to feel not very valuable, to have some scary safeguarding stuff go on outside of school, and to have that in your head when you walk into the classroom. And I also knew that the teachers that I was working alongside didn't necessarily know some of the things that I knew because of my family, because of my degree, about psychology, about things like just talked about cortisol and trauma and how those can affect children's behaviour. And then my colleagues would teach students who I felt were a bit like my sisters. And I was just very aware that actually without that being equipped with that evidence about trauma, they might not necessarily have been doing the best things for those students, or the way they were thinking about them wasn't with that in mind. And after I'd been teaching for a few years, I went to work in social mobility policy. I was really interested in why do we see patterns in education outcomes? Why do we see that always the most privileged end up dominating our most powerful professions, and the most vulnerable too often have a cycle of vulnerability replicated with their own children? And I was working at the Social Mobility Commission, and it was then when I looked at the exclusion data and thought, that doesn't match what I know from being on the front line, what my best friends in teaching are telling me about how many children are leaving their schools. These numbers are way too low. And it was then that I dug deeper and went to spend a year researching school exclusion. And I found that the pattern I was feeling with my own sisters, with the students I'd taught, was replicated nationally. That invariably the most vulnerable children often are the ones who fall out of the system through exclusion, and that isn't just caught in permanent exclusion data, the official statistics, that there's a whole world of hidden exclusion. And actually there are 50,000 pupils in the sector for excluded students. And I just felt that was an injustice, and it was the injustice that was why I became a teacher. And it made me want to do something, and setting up the Difference charity is part of that, empowering teachers and creating the head teachers of tomorrow who care about the things that we're talking about, Lisa. That's what the Difference has been set up to do. So,
which is fantastic. And it's really interesting to me, because when I speak to people about vulnerability, whatever sector that's in, whatever context, and I ask people, to dig a little deeper about what their driver is, there's always something, like with you were around adoption. So you were around trauma. You have your psychology first degree. Your sisters experienced exclusion. There's something experiential usually that drives people to have this passion. And so I wonder, that makes me wonder, and I can't imagine there's an answer to this, but there's something in there for me about how we equip people who don't have any experiential knowledge or learning around the impact of trauma, the impact of disrupted attachment, the impact of exclusion. I mean, that's one of the things, the Timpson Review is very clear about who was getting excluded. There were no surprises. But the impact of exclusion, what happens to people when they leave school without any qualifications? Where do they go? Does anyone care? It's almost like there's this, they're no longer children, they're no longer here, I can no longer see them. So we have this double kind of whammy of not being able to see through an experiential lens, or that it even exists, that it's even a thing, and then that invisibility mirrored back by that young person just somehow being perceived of as falling off the edge of the earth.
And that's tough. I mean, and there's a lot in there, right, Lisa? I think that we can want to create binaries because that's how we understand the world. And we can want to create categories and say, like, I'm all right, you're not all right. This person's experienced trauma, person hasn't experienced trauma. But I actually think that there's far more that unites us than divides us. I think if we think about our broader family tree, our broader friendship group, we all know people who suffer trauma, and it's not all the same trauma. My mum died a year and a half ago, and there were times in the grieving process where I was just not in control of my own emotions, and that is a trauma. It's an acute trauma. It's not one that's happening whilst I'm a child, so it's not a developmental trauma, but it does give me an insight and a snapshot into what experiencing acute trauma in the moment feels like. And it gives me a link to empathy for people whose traumas I can't understand, but I might see some parallels. And I actually think that's all of us. We should all be able to find the threads of empathy between us and other people, rather than looking at the kind of ways that we're different. And I think it's building on that helps us see those parallels everywhere. And we're talking about exclusion. We're not just talking about how traumatized pupils are overrepresented, and they are. If you have a social worker, you're more than 10 times more likely to have been excluded. And obviously that's an indication that you've suffered a really significant trauma outside of school, potentially. But also Black Caribbean students are over-excluded. And, there are lots of groups that are over-excluded, and we can kind of cut people up into little groups. We can also be empathetic and think about the similarities of experiences that people might have that can kind of escalate and become more challenging and lead to exclusion. I'm losing myself, Lisa. What did you ask me? You asked me.
You're there because what you're saying is that actually it's exactly what I always hope to do, which is to help people tap into that space within themselves. The difficulty, I think, with it is that it requires you to be vulnerable. And if you're in a toxic environment or an environment that's not working, or you don't get on with your colleagues, whatever, being that vulnerable can be really difficult. And I guess the beauty of what you're doing, which is having a long period of time with somebody, makes it much easier for that vulnerability to be accessed. When you're going into a school delivering a day's training, I mean, I'm lucky I've got 2 days next week with this pupil referral unit, but when you have one day, asking people to tap into that vulnerable space can be very challenging, because you want people to feel safe. And of course, as we dive into those spaces within ourselves, that can feel quite unsafe if you're not part of a culture where it's okay to be a human being.
Right. And we thought a lot about that in the design of the Difference Leaders programme. I was really clear that we're putting brilliant professionals in really challenging contexts where they're dealing with very distressing disclosures often, or they might witness things that are hard. And they're the kinds of people that run towards a challenge and run towards an emergency rather than away from it. But those sometimes are the people who also might not look after themselves, or who really need, you're right, that extra support to be vulnerable and to be effective. So that's why we made supervision a really key part of our programme. CAMS workers, child and adolescent mental health services, might have supervision. Social workers ought to have a clinical supervision where they can talk about difficult, challenging cases. And we're doing the same thing for teachers. And that's quite a pioneering thing. The difference is using supervision as that space where teachers can come to talk about challenging relationships, challenging instances with pupils, and can understand them and then can better deal with them. So I'm really, really proud of that. And the other thing is that we've got great relationships within our team. You're right, we've got 2 years. This is a programme that's really about developing someone on their career, helping kind of incubate them and, I guess, turbocharge them, I hope, towards headship eventually. Lots of our current Difference Leaders will be taking assistant headship, deputy headship as their position after the Difference Leaders programme. But they're there with 9 other people in the room. and 9 other people who are also being vulnerable, sharing their expertise, really becoming a network with. And that's what we really need to keep teachers in the profession and to keep people safe and strong while they're doing hard work, is relationships with other people who can carry them when things are hard.
Absolutely.
And encourage them when they're good.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's just so interesting to learn all about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And, you know, it's just been great to have that deeper conversation and have a bit of a deeper dive. I mean, you know, what's your vision for the next year? You know, what's your vision? You know, you're clearly somebody with lots of vision, lots of foresight. You're creative, innovative. I'm so glad it was you and not Kathy Burke. That's all I'm saying.
That's very kind, Lisa. I'm not sure.
What is your vision in the next year, 3 years? Where are you heading?
Yeah. So the difference's vision over the next year is let's do this together. So it is not the case that England's schools are not inclusive. It's not the case that teachers don't care about their vulnerable learners. Teachers, you're out there, or you who are listening, you know a teacher who's out there who cares about this stuff. And what we really want to do, the difference, is help those people come together and find each other. That's why we're doing 2 conferences, one in the north and one in the south. The Northern Conference is in Sheffield, but we've got speakers from Manchester. As our headliner, Estelle Morris is coming to talk to us about her decades of work on social justice and education, the only education secretary to have been a teacher. And our Included South is in London, and we've got some fantastic speakers, including from Glasgow, talking about the Glasgow model in knife crime and how they worked in schools to reduce knife crime. So we've got a fantastic, exciting stuff. We want to see as many teachers as possible coming to those conferences. It's £10. It's a nominal fee to pay for your lunch, but to meet each other and to start talking about these things. If you're feeling isolated, if you care about this stuff, to meet other professionals who also care about this work. So that's number 1, the next year. That's our vision, bring people together. Our 3-year vision is inspire more teachers to become leaders, because we need tomorrow's head teachers to be inclusive, and we need them to feel strong and brave to make hard decisions in their schools and to corral one another and inspire one another. So we're doing that through the Difference Leaders programme. We're looking for middle leaders across Yorkshire and the Humber, Greater Manchester and London to apply to the Difference, to become a Difference leader and spend 2 years in a pupil referral unit or an AP academy as an associate senior leader or a deputy head teacher. And that's our 3-year strategy. So, and our long-term strategy, you know what, who knows? I think it's silly to plan too far ahead, but really the Difference wants to bring people together, and I want to write that 5-year strategy with some of the people listening to this podcast right now.
You are a phenomenal woman, Kiran Gill. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you.